Welcome to Magic Arcanum. I'm Ryan Gomez. Behind the camera is Nicole Letson, and we're so glad you're here because it's story time. Modern Horizons has a ton of Easter eggs hidden within the art and card names, so we're gonna try something different today and call out as many as we can find. All right, here we go. Nicole, you have to keep count so we can put the final number in the title, because I didn't add them all up yet. Now, the whole set is basically a callback to Time Spiral, which itself was a callback to earlier events within the Magic story. The problem with Time Spiral was that many of the references were too obscure, and even though they did much better with Modern Horizons, there are still a few that might go over the average player's head. Good thing I'm here. Answered Prayers. This one behaves a lot like Halcyon Glaze from the original Ravnica City of Guilds, but enchantments that turn into creatures can be traced back even further. Urza's Saga block had many white, green, and blue enchantments that would come alive, but only when your opponent cast a creature. Turns out, the game is a lot more fun when you reward players for doing things rather than punish them. And so, Answered Prayers now encourages you to play your own creatures rather than make your opponent regret trying to summon theirs. Astral Drift. This is an updated version of Astral Slide, originally from Onslaught, and it will still pair well with creatures like Eternal Witness in a modern deck. Battle Screech. This isn't a new card, it's actually a reprint from Judgment, but it was also printed as a common in Vintage Masters, which makes this an attractive card for Pauper players that like having the modern border or the updated artwork. Enduring Sliver. Slivers were a creature type we saw for the first time way back in Tempest, and I talk about them in one of my other videos, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time here on this one, but I do want to talk about this guy because it borrows the Outlast ability from Khans of Tarkir, which was a much more recent set. Ephemerate. Making a creature leave the battlefield and then immediately return can be traced back to a card from Urza's Destiny called Flicker, which was a sorcery. As an instant, Ephemerate becomes much more useful in saving your creature from an opponent's removal spell, or preventing them from dying in combat if things start to go badly for you. Just be careful with the rebound half, because any creature you use it on won't be able to attack that turn unless it has haste. Face of Divinity. This feels very similar to Daybreak Coronet, originally a Future Sight card, right down to the glowing halo around the head of the subject in the artwork. Generous Gift. Let's talk about color shifts. Sometimes in Magic, they design a card that feels right at the time, but then later they realize it fits better in another color. Beast Within from New Phyrexia was a green card that was able to destroy a creature without you controlling a creature of your own. While it worked flavorfully, it gave green a way to kill things without having to fight them, which is supposed to be a weakness for that color. So we have a color shift. The same card can exist as a white card, where it makes more sense mechanically, and also keeps an appropriate flavor behind it. And while we're on the topic of color shifts, Planar Chaos, which was part of the Time Spiral block, had several deliberate ones, Damnation being a black version of Wrath of God, for example. Since Modern Horizons has several such shifts in the spirit of Planar Chaos, we could consider them all to be Easter eggs too. Giver of Runes is an updated take on Mother of Runes, who first appeared in Urza's Legacy. Notice how the creature type has changed to core, and she can offer protection from colorless, which is a nod to the core facing off against the colorless Eldrazi on Zendikar. Imposter of the Sixth Pride. Our first changeling, doing a spot-on impression of Blade of the Sixth Pride from Future Sight. Changelings come from the Lorwyn block, where they helped hold some of the tribal themes together. And they do the same job here in Modern Horizons, while also giving us reskinned versions of some classic cards. King of the Pride. I think this is our first reference to a true alpha card, the mighty Savannah Lions, which was a rare to give you some idea of how far creatures have come power-wise over the last 25 years. And down there in the flavor text, we get a quote from the Love Song of Night and Day, which appeared on tons of cards from Mirage and Visions. This was a real poem written as part of the world building for Jamora, a region of Dominaria that was the home to these two sets. Knight of Old Benalia. So aside from looking like he just wandered onto the set for Avengers Endgame, this is another shining example of how this set shares a lot of DNA with Time Spiral. In that set, creatures were being pulled through time portals from the past into the present, and that's exactly what's happening here with this guy who finds himself arriving in New Benalia. He should probably brush up on his history while he's here. Martyr's Soul. Mechanically, this borrows a lot from Nantuko Shaman from Time Spiral, which also rewarded you for playing it without tapping your lands. The art, along with the use of Convoke, tie this card to Ravnica, the City of Guilds. On Thin Ice. There's been one other white enchantment that imprisons a creature on a specific type of land, and that was Chained to the Rocks from Theros. Just like how that one was a white card that encouraged you to run mountains in your deck, this one depends on snowlands, while most of the other cards looking for those are green or blue. Ranger Captain of Eos. He must have gotten a promotion since his time on Alara when he was just Ranger of Eos. He's picked up some toughness and slimmed down on his mana cost, and perched on his shoulder looks like War Falcon, which fits both his ability and creature type. So I'm counting this one as a double Easter egg. No. Recruit the Worthy. Future Sight gave us Sprout Swarm, a token-making instant that also had buyback and Convoke. Recruit drops the Convoke bit, but otherwise, this could be seen as a color-shifted version of this popular popper card. Segovian Angel. All right, a couple of things going on here. First, the art follows Serra Angel, at least the version they started using in 9th edition. The flying and vigilance abilities are direct copies too, but the 1 power and 1 toughness make this a very small angel, and that's because she's on Segovia. We've only seen one other creature from this plane, and that was Segovian Leviathan, which despite being a massive sea monster is only a 3/3. So the joke is, things on Segovia are very, very small, and this angel is just a tiny version of the classic Serra Angel. Serra the Benevolent. Speaking of Serra Angel, if you've ever wondered where all of these winged beauties come from, it was this planeswalker. Now, Serra deserves her own entire video, so for this one, I'll just point out that her -3 ability, again, literally just makes Serra angels. Settle Beyond Reality. The cutout figure here feels a lot like Journey to Nowhere from Zendikar, which is fitting because both cards send someone to exile. Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. Our first legendary creature has a long history in the story of Magic, but I'll try and keep it brief. Sisay was captain of the Weatherlight, and her original card cared about legendary creatures, which kind of symbolized her ability to rally the crew. Back in Dominaria, we even got to see one of her descendants in Shauna Sisay's legacy, but she cares more about the number of other creatures you have rather than their color or legendary status. Soul Strike Technique. Here we see a Jeskai monk from Tarkir practicing the magic taught to his people by Ugin the Spirit Dragon long, long ago. These manifestations eventually became morphs, and those would form the foundations of warfare between the rival clans on the plane as Ugin recovered from his fatal but not fatal encounter with Nicol Bolas. You can hear more about that in my Chronicles of Bolas video series, so go check it out if you want to hear that story. Splicer's Skill. Art-wise, we're seeing echoes of Phyrexian Splicer in here, a card from Tempest. Mechanically, though, we're seeing a combination of Sensor Splicer from New Phyrexia and the Splice mechanic from Kamigawa Block, now able to work with any instant or sorcery instead of only arcane ones. What can I say? Splicers be splicin'. Vespelark. It appears Revelark from Morningtide had a offspring of some kind. It's a smaller Revelark, right? Yeah, I guess. Wall of 1,000 Cuts. We can trace this one all the way back to Alpha with the original Wall of Swords, although the art for it didn't really get good until 10th edition. Based on the type of swords and the use of the word bolster in the flavor text, I think Wall of 1000 Cuts is set on Tarkir, but without a dragon in the art anywhere. Guess we can't really be sure. Winds of Abandon. Form and function-wise, we're getting a callback to Path to Exile from Conflux, one of the signature removal spells of the modern format. I do not expect Winds to fully replace Path, but it will probably be a commander staple in the years to come. Zal Fear and Decoy. Back when I was much younger, and I was first learning Magic, the friend who taught me how to play had a green deck, and I absolutely could not beat it. It was stuffed with some of the biggest creatures in the game, and I felt stuck until I discovered a card in Tempest called Master Decoy. I loved everything about this card. The goofy art, the ridiculous premise that an entire crash of rhinos would be distracted and chase this guy riding a unicorn zebra, all of it. So when I saw the decoy back and ready to troll my opponent once again, oh, I could not help but smile. On to the blue cards. Bizarre Trade Mage. Oh, okay, wow, where do I even begin with this guy? His ability is identical to Bazaar of Baghdad from Arabian Nights. The flavor text, though, alludes to a ton of other cards like Aladdin's Lamp, Disrupting Scepter, Mox Ruby, and of course, Flying Carpet. I also just want to point out here that the character Aladdin is in the public domain and not owned by anyone, mouse or otherwise. Echo of Eons. In the history of Magic, there are 9 cards that are revered above all others. They are fittingly called the Power 9, and among them you will find Time Twister, first appearing all the way back in Alpha. Everdream, another splice card, but this time with a more clean lineage. Evermind from Saviors of Kamigawa. Giving all your other instants and sorceries the ability to replace themselves as you cast them could make this one of the breakout cards in the set, and having art that will really pop as a foil doesn't hurt either. Force of Negation. The Force cards in Modern Horizons make up a cycle across all 5 colors, but the blue one here has the privilege of being an actual throwback to a previous card, Force of Will from Alliances. Even this slightly watered down version will keep your opponent on edge as you are able to protect yourself despite being tapped out. Iceberg Cantrix. The original Zendikar gave us Hedron Crab, who would put cards from your opponent's library into their graveyard when you made landfall. The nickname for that is Mill, which comes from Millstone, and I spent like 6 minutes trying to come up with some version of Chill Mill Crab, but I couldn't quite get there. Merit Lage's Slumber. Pound for pound, Merit Lage might be the most mysterious creature in all of Magic, even more so than the Eldrazi. She was mentioned in the flavor text of a few cards in Ice Age, but didn't really show up herself until Dark Depths in Cold Snap. And the lack of any real origin story has driven players crazy for years now. Oh, and she's also visible in Time of Ice from Dominaria, so snow has always been her thing as far as we know. Mirrodin Besieged. We get to count this one as a double because it behaves like the Siege cycle of enchantments from Fate Reforged, but the events depicted are part of the story from, well, Mirrodin Besieged. In that set, the brave Mirrodin natives did their best to hold back the invading Phyrexian forces, but ultimately their world was overrun, as you can probably guess from the second choice on this card. Phantasmal Form. Another deep cut. This one pays homage to the art style of Phantom Monsters reprint in Eternal Masters, but the 3/3 flyer itself existed all the way back in Alpha. Phantom Ninja. Oh, we talked about color-shifted cards earlier, but this is another trick Wizards of the Coast likes to pull, where they reprint a card but make a small change to something like the creature type. Take Phantom Warrior from Portal, update the creature type to be relevant with your latest set, and bam! Sweet ninja, bro. Pondering Mage. I really do love the art on this one, but the name feels a bit on the nose for being a direct reference to Ponder, first printed in Lorwyn, but it didn't pick up the 3 moons until Magic 2010. Hey, you know that shirt with the 3 wolves howling at the moon? If I got that shirt but with the 3 ponder moons, would that be more cool or less? Nicole, what do you think? Anyway, Rebuild. While not a super exciting reprint, the art on this one does show cards like Bonesaw, Ring of Gix, and Paradise Plume, all of which are noteworthy artifacts from Magic's history. String of Disappearances. Not technically a color shift, but it does feel a lot like the blue version of Chain Lightning from Legends. I'm hoping to make this one work in my mono blue pauper deck, affectionately called the Bounce House. Tribute Mage. Blue has always had the closest relationship to artifacts, and over the years, they've assembled an interesting team of creatures that can go and fetch them out of your deck. I believe it started with Trinket Mage in 5th Dawn, then Treasure Mage in Mirrodin Besieged, and the series continued with Trophy Mage in Aether Revolt. It looks like Wizards of the Coast wanted to slip us one more, and to really hammer home what you're supposed to go and search up with this one, the art shows Sword of the Meek, which happens to cost exactly 2 mana. We get it, Wizards. We get it. Twisted Reflection. By itself, blue can shrink a creature's power and swap its power and toughness, but doing both at the same time gives blue the type of removal it's just not supposed to have. By adding black to the Entwine cost, this spell, already a reference to Twisted Image from Scars of Mirrodin, can behave like Agony Warp from Shards of Alara. Urza, Lord High Artificer. Much like Serra, I should probably make an entire video devoted just to Urza because he was a major player in Magic for the first 10 or 15 years of the game. Even today, his creation Karn is still active in the story, and we feel Urza's legacy on Dominaria. While Urza was known as a mighty planeswalker, this card depicts him earlier in life during his war against his own brother, Mishra. And if you want to see how he could have won the whole thing in one afternoon, if only he had Sword of the Meek handy, go check out that episode of Pretty Dece. Watcher for Tomorrow. The Hideaway ability appeared on a cycle of lands from Lorwyn and returns here now with a new twist, being stapled onto a creature for the first time. That does it for blue. Let's talk black cards. Azra Smokeshaper. One cool part of Magic's history is the sheer variety of creature types that have been added to the game over 25 years. The Azra are a recent inclusion, first seen in Battle Bond, and their demonic ancestry makes them an interesting tribe to see further developed, so hopefully there are more on the modern horizon. Cabal Therapist. Just like how Pondering Mage put ponder on a creature, here we've got Cabal Therapy with legs. The original art, first seen in Judgment, even depicts this horror going about his day job, just picking people's brains apart with his bare hands. Changeling Outcast. Like I said before, many of the changelings in this set are reskins of classic cards, and this one is doing his best impression of Tormented Soul from Magic 2012. Defile. Remember how Segovian Angel was a scaled-down version of Serra Angel? Modern Horizons pulls that trick a few times, like with this version of Torment's Mutilate, now hitting just one creature instead of all of them. Endling. Cycles are one of my favorite parts of Magic, by which I mean seeing the same idea expressed across all 5 colors. Sometimes this happens within one set, like it does here with the Force cards I mentioned earlier, but sometimes cycles get spread out over years. Morphling, Torchling, Thornling, and Brightling have waited a long time to get their missing zombie sister. She's finally here. First Sphere Gargantua. In addition to fighting his own brother, Urza eventually waged war against the Phyrexians, who divide their home up into 9 distinct spheres, each one containing more horrors than the last. The first sphere is actually the most tame out of all of them, and it still contains 5/4 creatures that claw their way back from death while giving their controller card advantage. More specifically, we're getting references to Phyrexian Gargantua and Phyrexian Rager, both from Apocalypse. Bonus, you get to see the Rager in Exclude, too. Force of Despair. We already mentioned this cycle and how they all reference Force of Will, but the black one here also calls back to another weirdly templated card in Planar Chaos called Cradle to Grave. Graveshifter, another changeling, another direct reference, this time impersonating Gravedigger, and the art they started using for him as far back as Tempest. Headless Specter. While Azra may be one of Magic's newer creature types, Specters go all the way back to Alpha with Hypnotic Specter. The flavor text on our headless friend here is also a sly reference to the Hymn to Turok, which also makes an opponent discard cards at random. Mindrake. Modern Horizons has a ton of mechanics represented on cards, and even alludes to a few more, like Madness here in the flavor text. Cards with Madness can be played as you discard them, which means they synergize perfectly with the Overload ability on Mindrake. Mob. On the plane of Innistrad, werewolves have gone from being a threat to humans to being one of their better allies while Avacyn was around, and then back to being dangerous again when Emrakul and Nahiri showed up. I think Arlen Cord is going to be key to rebuilding bridges here, but for now, the humans on this plane aren't taking any chances and seem to be eradicating any werewolves they find. Plague Engineer, another multi-egg. We've got a play on Engineered Plague in the name and the ability here, but the real gem is in the creature type. Urza's Legacy gave us 4 other carriers, which could be sacrificed to offer increasingly debilitating levels of stat reduction on your opponent's creatures. The flavor text on the new Engineer even serves as the final entry into their progress notes as they watch their own disease spread. Ransack the Lab. The flavor text here mentions Gisa and Geralf, siblings who live on Innistrad and are rival necromancers. They get their own legendary creature team up in Eldritch Moon, and Ransack here feels a bit like Forbidden Alchemy from the original Innistrad set. Return from Extinction. Obviously this card works with creatures of any shared type, but the art shows us slivers specifically because they are in Modern Horizons, but also because they did in fact literally return from extinction when the Riptide Project scientists found their fossils and reanimated them. Shatter Assumptions. Urza's Saga gave us Persecute, and Invasion gave us Addle, either of which could have been the inspiration for this card, which seems to have a bit of a Ravnica theme to it. I'm picking up a Sin Collector vibe here in the art, maybe? Silumgar's Scavenger. Tarkir is a plane full of interesting characters, maybe second only to Ravnica. Silumgar is an elder dragon, and Exploit was the signature mechanic of his underlings in Dragons of Tarkir. Sling Gang Lieutenant. Goblins willing to use other goblins as ammunition has been a running gag in Magic for a long time. The Lieutenant may have picked up some tricks from Siege Gang Commander, who first appeared in Scourge over 15 years ago. Wow. Smiting Helix. It's important for each color to have their own strengths and weaknesses and abilities that make them feel different from one another, but some amount of overlap is inevitable. White gets to heal, red gets to deal damage, and black's ability to drain the life out of something to heal itself could be seen as a little a column A, little a column B. When you put that all together on one card, you get a sly callback to the beloved Lightning Helix from the original Ravnica block. Umezawa's Charm. Kamigawa block was pretty ambitious for its time and gave us an abundance of legendary characters, many of which still show up in commander decks. One of the most famous cards from that period of time isn't a creature though, it's Umezawa's Jitte, an equipment with 3 different activated abilities that are all captured here on the Charm. Umezawa himself also had a card, and his descendants still appear in the Magic story, most recently with Tetsuko Umezawa in Dominaria. Venomous Changeling. Make sure you check your boot before you put it on, or you might find this imitator of Deadly Scorpion from the original Zendikar set. Yawgmoth, Thran Physician. Much like Serra and Urza, the story behind Yawgmoth could easily fill its an entire own video. He's been referenced on other cards as far back as Antiquities, but most of his best hits come from Urza's Saga block. Even today, his legacy can be felt on Dominaria, and was recently revisited with a saga that only hints at how terrible and evil he really was. Wow, those black cards were insane. Let's hit red. Aria of Flame. The use of verse counters calls back to a 10-card cycle of enchantments from Urza's Saga, with a rare and uncommon for each color. Bogardan Dragonheart. Dominaria housed a lot of Magic's early sets. Rather than move the action to a new plane, they would just let it play out on one of the many islands or continents available on this plane. Bogardan is part of the Burning Isles, where the natives believe the surrounding volcanoes are actually gods and eagerly sacrifice both strangers and family members to the fires. The dragon he turns into here could be a reference to Volcanic Dragon from Mirage. Goatnap. I mentioned earlier how changelings in Lorwyn block help the tribal themes really shine, but it also let the designers of the game have a bit of fun with Goatnapper from Lorwyn. It would let you steal a goat, but it was printed in a set that had no actual goat cards. Now, clever players would realize all the changelings that their opponent had in play were in fact also goats, and you could use that same trick in your next limited game of Modern Horizons with Goatnap. Goblin Engineer. Most of the time, Magic uses goblins as comic relief characters. They're loud, they're dumb, they're highly expendable. But there was one group of goblins entrusted with the care and maintenance of some pretty advanced machinery by some people called the Thran. The ability on Goblin Engineer is a callback to Goblin Welder, roughly. But art-wise, this little dude is sitting inside the crawl space, which was part of something called the Mana Rig, which could be used to produce Power Stones. And those were of great interest to this guy named Urza. Goblin Oriflame. The very first Magic cards revolutionized gaming forever, but they were not perfect, no. In fact, some very big errors managed to make their way into Alpha, and one such mistake was the casting cost on a card called Orcish Oriflame. The game designers had intended for this enchantment to cost 4 mana, not 2, believing it to be a very powerful effect. And so in the next set, it was printed correctly, but the legend of the Oriflame lived on. And of course, now we realize that 2 mana is a fair price to pay for 1 extra power across all your attackers, making Goblin Oriflame a tribute to the broken original. Orcish Hellraiser. The Echo mechanic was introduced in Urza's Saga, and it allowed some aggressively costed creatures because they all had an inherent downside. You had to pay for it again. But Goblin Marshal flipped the script and gave you a bonus when it died, which encouraged you to not necessarily pay that Echo. Pashilic Mons. Amazingly, alongside Urza and Serra and Yawgmoth and the other characters with ancient history dating back to Magic's earliest days, you will also find mention of this legend on the card Mons Goblin Raiders from Alpha. Pillage. Making its entrance to Modern after being reprinted several times since its debut in Alliances, the flavor text here is coming from Lovisa Cold Eyes, a legend from Cold Snap. She also appeared in the art for Time of Ice, having played a big role in the history of Dominaria. Planebound Accomplice. Giving us a twist on Sneak Attack, we've got another famous card stapled onto a creature variant. The art even shows the new Planeswalker from Modern Horizons, Renin 6, although they're probably one of the worst walkers you could cheat into play with the Accomplice. Pyrophobia. Planeswalkers are certainly the marquee characters for Magic, but I derive so much joy in following the adventures and misadventures of the supporting cast. Norin the Wary from Time Spiral makes a guest appearance here, still just as unenthusiastic about his situation as ever. Oh, and the Cowards bit goes back to Boldwire Intimidator from Future Sight. Why does that matter in Modern Horizons? All your opponents' changelings are also cowards. Ravenous Giant. There exists a certain list of cards that the creators of Magic have promised to never reprint again, and on this reserved list, you will find a demon called Juzam de Jin. Luckily, this pledge still permits color-shifted versions of those exclusive cards to be created, and thus we have a spiritual successor to the original creature from Arabian Nights. Seasoned Pyromancer. Oh, they grow up so fast, don't they? The young Pyromancer from M14 still makes his elemental tokens and still rocks a pair of welding goggles in tribute to everyone's favorite hothead, Shondra. Vengeful Devil. Morbid came to us first on the plane of Innistrad, where it's basically Halloween every day, and this playful little fellow would fit right in there alongside friends like Scalding Devil or Tybalt. Viashino Sand Sprinter. The hit-and-run tactics of the Viashino have been showing up on cards as far back as Mirage, but our Sand Sprinter friend here seems to be most closely resembling Viashino Sand Stalker from Visions. And I think that does it for red. What's our egg count up to, Nicole? What do you mean you lost count? All right, anyway, onward we go. Ayula's Influence. Exodus gave us Seismic Assault, an enchantment for triple red mana that turns your discarded lands into 2 damage. And by shifting to triple green, we get a similar enchantment that makes bears who attack for 2 damage. Bellowing Elk. Core Set 2019 introduced us to Vivian Reed, and in the last year, she's been acting as a sort of Steve Irwin of the multiverse, explaining all the subtleties of life across various planes. In this case, she's explaining that if the elk is yelling at you, it's because they don't like you. Wow, Vivian, really glad you're here to tell us this stuff. Collector Oof. Okay, so oofs are a weird bit of Magic's history. The first one was actually Shelkin Brownie from Legends, who started as a fairy, but was later updated to be an oof. It wasn't until Ice Age that oofs started getting their own real look and mechanical identity, which seems to be messing with artifacts. One also appeared in Future Sight, which is probably the grounds for this collector appearing in Modern Horizons, who looks to be holding on to an artifact called the Null Rod from Weatherlight, and the flavor text here pretty much confirms it. Crashing Footfalls. You might have caught it earlier, but did you know a group of rhinos is called a crash? The wordplay is put to good effect here, as you'll hear these tokens coming long before you actually see them. Deep Forest Hermit. There is an internal tension within Magic design, right? Make the cards too goofy and players will roll their eyes as they remember this is a kid's card game. Make the cards too serious and players will roll their eyes as they remember this is a game and should be fun. When these forces are in perfect balance, as all things should be, you get squirrels. Back in Urza's Legacy, the deranged hermit brought his army of furry little friends out, and now we can argue all over again if 15 squirrels could really stop Emrakul. Elvish Fury. The armor on the left figure tells us this little scene is happening on Dominaria, most likely in the Lanta War Forest, home of the Lanta War Elves, who started warning everyone to stay off their turf as early as 5th edition. Maybe this guy didn't get the message. Excavating Anurid. Kinda like the oofs, Anurids are a tribe that haven't gotten a lot of attention over the years, so the closest cousin to this one is Anurid Barkripper from Judgment. The similarities go right down to the flavor text. Frostwalla. Taking advantage of the snow themes in Modern Horizon, we find the cold-blooded relative to the original Rootwalla from Tempest. Hex Drinker. The level up mechanic first appeared in Rise of the Eldrazi, so players would have something to do with the boatloads of mana they were generating while trying to summon, well, Eldrazi. Protection from Everything is a line that has only appeared on one other creature in the history of Magic though, and that one was also kind of snake-like. Progenitus. Lanta War Tribe. As we've already said, Lanta War is one of the mighty forests of Dominaria and home to the alpha card Lanta War Elves. If you had 3 of them on the battlefield at once, they would cost you 3 green mana, tap for 3 green mana, and have a total of 3 power and 3 toughness. So if you do the math, the tribe is literally just 3 Llanowar elves. Murasa Behemoth. Zendikar has become one of the more fleshed out planes for Magic, having been visited multiple times over the years. Among its 7 distinct continents, you'll find Murasa, home to a variety of creatures and spells that seem to share an interest in cards in your graveyard. Nantuko Cultivator. Originally printed as a rare in Torment, this helpful little bug lives on Dominaria in the Croson Forest, or probably did until most of that region was destroyed during the chaotic times in the plane's history. Rime Tender. By now, you should be understanding that Dominaria has hosted a lot of action over Magic's 25 plus years, and at one point, the plane was gripped by an ice age. Some people wanted this to continue, and they did everything they could to prevent the impending thaw. Rime Tender here is a reference to other cards that cared about snow permanence, mostly from Cold Snap, but even as far back as Ice Age. Scale Up. A bit of a mismatch here. It feels like this card references Scaled Worm, but the power and toughness numbers are a better match for Craw Worm from Alpha. Spring Bloom Druid. Are you liking spells being put onto creatures? I hope so, because this druid is doing a pitch-perfect rendition of Harrow from Tempest. Tempered Sliver. Drawing both artistic and mechanical influence from Slith Predator. I want to pause here and address the flavor text because we answered that question in my video on what are slivers, and the answer was yes, because every time the slivers show up, something else does come along and kill them. Treefolk Umbra. Totem Armor came to us first in Rise of the Eldrazi, where it gave your creatures a fighting chance at some of the set's larger threats. Since this aura improves a creature's toughness and lets it deal combat damage based on that number, I'm going to say this is also a nod towards Doran the Siege Tower, a legendary treefolk that grants the same ability. Trumpeting Herd. Recurring elephant tokens have been done before, starting with Elephant Ambush and Call of the Herd, both from Odyssey. Unbound Flourishing. Players love to double things, and this enchantment draws inspiration from Doubling Season, a fantastic way to enable the ultimate ability on many planeswalkers right when they enter the battlefield. Amazingly, they kept this one on an enchantment rather than move the ability to a creature like they did with several of the other cards, as we've already seen in Modern Horizons. Weather the Storm. Another card with a name that's right on the nose for references. This one will let you survive an opponent as they attempt to storm off with a card like Grape Shot, which uses the storm mechanic to make upwards of 20 copies of itself for lethal damage. And we're done with green, but we're not done with the set, so let's see what's hidden in the gold cards and the lands. Collected Conjuring. Dragons of Tarkir gave us one of the most busted cards in Modern with Collected Company. This version asks a lot more from you, being 2 colors instead of 1 and being a sorcery instead of an instant, so it remains to be seen how it will measure up to its green sibling. Eldamri's Call. I think I mentioned earlier how even though Planeswalkers are the star of Magic's story, over the years, there have been some really great supporting characters, and Eldamri was one such elf. He played a pretty big role in the Weatherlight Saga, and his call reflects his ability to rally together different factions like during the invasion of Dominaria. The First Sliver. My feelings on slivers have been well documented in another video, so I'll just say here that Cascade was introduced in Alara Reborn. But that does not mean slivers originated on Alara. Modern Horizons puts mechanics wherever it wants, so don't read too much into this. The origins of slivers remains just as mysterious as it was when they first appeared in Tempest. Good Fortune Unicorn. When I think of fantasy creatures, my list tends to include phoenixes, fairies, and basically everything the Sorceress faction had in Heroes of Might and Magic 2, which I spent way too much time playing growing up. They also have unicorns, so I was frustrated for a long time because these majestic creatures have not had much representation in Magic the Gathering. Just 15 other cards over the last 26 years. Anyway, I think it's good that we now have Good Fortune Unicorn, and now you all know what a big Might and Magic fan I am, so I'm sure I'm gonna hear about that in the comments. Ice Fang Codel. All right, time to test what we've learned about color shifts. Modern players have long hoped for the card Baleful Strix to enter the format, and Ice Fang does a decent enough impression while also resembling Winged Codel from Alara Reborn. So I'm calling this a double egg here. Kaya's Guile. Being one of the newer planeswalkers to join the ongoing story, Kaya is still a bit of a mystery. We don't know her home plane, but we do know that she acts as a blade for hire and loves putting ghosts to rest. She can turn herself incorporeal, but her heart stops beating whenever she does that, so she can't stay in her ghost form for too long. And she just took an oath to join the Gatewatch at the conclusion of War of the Spark. Lightning Skelemental. Combining a creature called Ball Lightning from a set called The Dark and Blightning from Shards of Alara, we get this spooky fellow who works great with Unearth, also in Modern Horizons. Munitions Expert. You see the shark over his shoulder? Okay, that's a reference to sharks. Next, Rot Widow Pack. Following in the 8 footsteps of their mom, Ishkana Graph Widow, these little spiders also bleed life out of your opponent, and they get more effective as your swarm grows. Thundering Djinn. Much better. The flavor text on this one mentions a bolt from a brainstorm, which are references to Lightning Bolt from Alpha and Brainstorm from Ice Age. Now, technically, if you played Brainstorm on your turn before you attacked with this guy, he'd deal 4 damage since you also drew your card for the turn. And that is more than the 3 that you get from a bolt. But I guess Slash from a storm doesn't quite have the same ring to it. Gold cards, check. Artifacts, oh, and then lands, and then after party at my place, Nicole. Arkham's Astrolab. Dominaria, as I mentioned before, at one point went through a massive ice age, and that's where we find Arkham Dagson, who used that long winter to study the artifacts left over from Urza's war with his own brother Mishra. The Astrolab is one of several artifacts to bear Arkham's name. Birthing Boughs. Changelings, as we've already said, first appeared in Lorwyn, and the flavor text on this artifact is a nod to the card Crib Swap from that set. Farmstead Gleaner. Scarecrows in Magic can be traced all the way back to the Dark, where they actually did prevent flying creatures from harming you, albeit at great expense. The Gleaner references more recent scarecrows like the ones found in Shadowmoor who use the untap symbol. Fountain of Ichor. Name-dropping the Sun Empire in the flavor text here, this one is tied to Ixalan, home of the planeswalker Huatli and a staggering number of dinosaurs. Fountain is playing off the mistaken belief that oil comes from the remains of dinosaurs, which isn't exactly true on Earth, but it could be true somewhere in the multiverse. Lesser Masticore. Urza's destiny is part of one of the most overpowered blocks in the history of Magic, and you might not think the original Masticore is much of a threat, especially after discarding multiple cards to it, but it turns out being able to repeatedly deal damage to creatures using mana of any color is a really valuable ability. Lesser Masticore keeps that, and even has his own version of regeneration by making use of Persist, which combined to make this a card that will be a limited deck all-star. Mox Tantalite. Remember earlier we mentioned the Power 9, which are some of the most game-bending cards in all of Magic? Well, 5 of those 9 cards are the Moxen, artifacts that produce mana just like lands, and there was one for each color back in Alpha. Over the years, we've had a few other Mox cards show up, and nothing gets players salivating like the opportunity to abuse free mana, so we'll have to see how this newest one lives up to the legacy of its forerunners. Swords of this and that. Equipment came onto the scene during the original Mirrodin block, with Dark Steel giving us 2 swords representing conflicts between the colors of Magic. Over time, that cycle was completed, but fans were left wanting the other 5 color combinations, and now, with Modern Horizons, we are 40% of the way there. Talisman of Conviction and friends. Much like the swords we just discussed, these 5 artifacts complete a cycle that started in the original Mirrodin block. Cave of Temptation. The Planar Chaos set considered adding a 6th color of mana to Magic, which would have been purple, and the lands would have likely been caves, but the designers felt that there wasn't enough mechanical identity to justify an entire other color entering the game, even for just one set. Fiery Islet and friends. Modern Horizons not only completed some long outstanding cycles, it started new ones, or in this case, built upon one previous card, Horizon Canopy from Future Sight, to create half a cycle, I guess. I'm confident we'll see the missing 4 lands and a reprint of Canopy somewhere down the road. Hall of Heliod's Generosity. Theros block introduced us to 15 gods that made their will felt across the plane, mostly through enchantments. This land depicts Heliod, the mono-white god, and plays well in a deck full of enchantments. In that way, it also references Serra's Sanctum, a land from Urza's saga that also rewarded you for playing enchantments, and Academy Ruins, a land from Time Spiral that put artifacts from your graveyard back on top of your library. Wow, we did it. We got through every Easter egg I could find in Modern Horizons, but I'm sure there are a ton that I missed. So, do not be shy about pointing them out in the comments. Then make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the great stories you'll only find here on Magic Arcanum. We'll see ya. Part of the joke is I don't know how to pronounce any of these. I said Cantrix earlier for the crab, which I don't think is right either.